Operation Northwoods, the U.S. military's false flag proposal. In the early 1960s, as Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated, the U.S. government was desperate to eliminate Fidel Castro's communist regime in Cuba. In response to this geopolitical threat, the Pentagon's top military brass devised a chilling plan known as Operation Northwoods, a proposal that, if executed, would have involved the U.S. government orchestrating terror attacks against its own citizens to justify war against Cuba. The plan, drafted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and presented to then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, outlined a series of staged events designed to manipulate public opinion and garner support for military intervention. These operations included hijacking planes, bombing U.S. cities, and even sinking boats filled with Cuban refugees, all of which would be falsely blamed on the Cuban government. One particularly disturbing aspect of the plan suggested engineering a fake Cuban terrorist campaign in Miami, Washington, D.C., and other cities by planting explosives and making it appear as if Castro's operatives were behind the attacks. Another proposal involved staging an attack on U.S. military personnel, where American soldiers disguised as Cuban agents would carry out violent acts against fellow troops, further intensifying the narrative that Cuba was a direct threat. Additionally, the Pentagon suggested creating a fabricated incident involving a commercial airliner, one that would appear to be shot down by Cuban forces. This plan entailed using a decoy aircraft painted to resemble a civilian jet, while a real plane filled with American citizens would be secretly landed at a secure location. Meanwhile, a military drone disguised as the passenger jet would be destroyed mid-air, giving the illusion that Cuba had committed an act of war against innocent civilians. These deceptive tactics were seen as necessary evils by high-ranking officials who sought an excuse to overthrow Castro's regime and eliminate communism from the Western Hemisphere. However, the proposal never came to fruition. When Operation Northwoods reached President John F. Kennedy, he was reportedly appalled and rejected the plan outright. His firm refusal to authorize such extreme measures put him at odds with his military advisors, and some theorists speculate that his opposition to these covert operations may have contributed to the tensions that surrounded his eventual assassination. The existence of Operation Northwoods remained a closely guarded secret for decades, until declassified documents revealed its shocking details in the 1990s. While the plan was never officially carried out, it remains one of the most unsettling examples of how far governments are sometimes willing to go to justify military actions. It also underscores the lengths to which propaganda, deception, and psychological warfare can be used to manipulate public perception and shape geopolitical strategies. The exposure of Operation Northwoods fueled skepticism about government transparency and deepened public distrust in official narratives, reinforcing the belief that truth is often obscured behind classified documents and redacted reports. The CIA's MKUltra, mind control experiments on unwitting citizens. MKUltra was one of the most infamous covert operations in American history, a top-secret CIA project aimed at developing mind control techniques through experiments on unsuspecting individuals. Launched in the early 1950s during the height of the Cold War, the program was driven by fears that Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean intelligence agencies were using mind control methods on prisoners of war and political dissidents. The CIA sought to stay ahead in the psychological warfare race, leading to a program that would span 2 decades and involve some of the most ethically dubious human experimentation ever conducted by the U.S. government. Under the leadership of Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, MKUltra employed a variety of methods to manipulate and break the human mind, including the administration of high doses of hallucinogenic drugs such as LSD, electroshock therapy, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological torture. These experiments were carried out in universities, hospitals, prisons, and even military institutions, often without the subject's consent or knowledge. Some individuals were lured into participating under the pretense of medical treatment or scientific research, while others were outright kidnapped and subjected to relentless psychological conditioning. One of the most disturbing aspects of MKUltra was the CIA's fascination with LSD as a potential tool for mind control. Agency operatives believed that the drug could be used to weaken a person's resistance to interrogation, alter their personality, and potentially turn them into unwitting assassins. To test this theory, CIA agents and scientists dosed unwitting individuals, including mental patients, prisoners, and even their own personnel, with the powerful hallucinogen and observed their reactions. In some cases, subjects were kept under the influence of LSD for weeks at a time, leading to severe psychological trauma and lasting mental damage. Among the most infamous cases tied to MKUltra was the story of Frank Olson, a U.S. Army biochemist who was unknowingly given LSD by his CIA colleagues. Shortly afterward, he began experiencing extreme paranoia and psychological distress. Days later, he mysteriously fell to his death from a hotel window in New York City. The official story claimed suicide, but declassified documents and later investigations suggested foul play, fueling theories that the CIA had orchestrated his death to cover up the program's unethical activities. The full extent of MKUltra remained hidden from the public until the 1970s, when the U.S. Senate launched an investigation into CIA abuses. The Church Committee hearings revealed shocking details about the program, but by that time, most of the relevant files had already been destroyed by order of CIA Director Richard Helms. The lack of concrete records left many questions unanswered, allowing rumors and conspiracy theories to flourish. To this day, MKUltra serves as a haunting reminder of how easily ethics can be discarded in the pursuit of power and control. The program's exposure eroded public trust in government institutions and sparked widespread fears about secret experimentation on civilians. Though the CIA officially shut down MKUltra in the early 1970s, many believe that similar programs continued under different names, hidden in the shadows of classified intelligence operations. The legacy of MKUltra continues to influence pop culture, from books and films to conspiracy theories about government control, raising the unsettling question: if such a program was allowed to exist once, could it happen again? COINTELPRO, the FBI's covert war against activists. During the height of political unrest in the United States, the Federal Bureau of Investigation launched one of the most controversial domestic intelligence operations in modern history. COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, COINTELPRO was a secret initiative designed to infiltrate, surveil, and ultimately dismantle political organizations deemed subversive by the U.S. government. While the program was initially justified as a means to combat potential communist threats, it quickly expanded into a widespread operation targeting civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and anyone perceived as a challenge to the status quo. From 1956 to 1971, the FBI, under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, engaged in a relentless campaign of psychological warfare, using an arsenal of deceptive and illegal tactics to neutralize movements they feared could disrupt American power structures. Among the most targeted groups were the Black Panther Party, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the American Indian Movement, feminist organizations, and even students protesting the Vietnam War. Hoover believed that these groups, despite advocating for civil rights and systemic change, posed a grave danger to national security, often conflating activism with radical extremism. The methods employed by COINTELPRO were as sinister as they were effective. FBI agents planted informants within activist organizations, encouraging internal distrust and discord. They forged letters and spread disinformation to turn allies against one another, sometimes even inciting violence between rival factions. Infiltrators sabotaged events, discredited leaders through fabricated scandals, and manipulated the media to portray these movements as dangerous threats to public safety. One of the most notorious cases of COINTELPRO's influence was its relentless targeting of Martin Luther King Jr. As the face of the civil rights movement, King was seen as a major threat to the FBI's vision of social order. Agents wiretapped his phones, monitored his movements, and attempted to discredit him through a smear campaign. In a particularly disturbing episode, the FBI anonymously sent King a letter urging him to commit suicide, threatening to expose fabricated, damaging information about his personal life. Another major target of COINTELPRO was the Black Panther Party, a revolutionary socialist organization that provided community programs such as free breakfast initiatives and health clinics, while also advocating for self-defense against police brutality. The FBI viewed the Panthers as an existential threat and worked to systematically dismantle them. Agents spread false rumors that key leaders were government informants, leading to internal distrust and violent purges within the group. In one of the most shocking incidents, the FBI worked alongside local law enforcement to orchestrate the assassination of Fred Hampton, a rising leader in the Black Panther Party. In a pre-dawn raid on December 4, 1969, Chicago police stormed Hampton's apartment and shot him multiple times while he slept. The official police narrative claimed a shootout occurred, but later investigations revealed that the FBI had provided intelligence that enabled the ambush, which left Hampton dead and another Panther seriously wounded. The exposure of COINTELPRO in 1971 was not due to an official government disclosure, but rather a break-in at an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, by a group of activists known as the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. They uncovered classified documents detailing the illegal surveillance program, sparking public outrage and leading to congressional hearings on government overreach. The revelations forced the FBI to officially end COINTELPRO, but many suspect that similar tactics continue under different names. The legacy of COINTELPRO remains a dark stain on American history, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked government surveillance and political repression. Even today, echoes of COINTELPRO persist in debates over civil liberties, law enforcement tactics, and the surveillance of activist groups. It raises the unsettling question of how far the government is willing to go to suppress dissent, and whether similar covert operations continue under new guises. Iran-Contra affair, the secret arms deal that fueled a drug trade. The Iran-Contra affair remains one of the most explosive political scandals in U.S. history, exposing a secretive network of arms deals, covert funding, and direct government involvement in illegal activities. At the heart of the scandal was the Reagan administration's clandestine operation to sell weapons to Iran, despite an official arms embargo, and use the proceeds to fund right-wing rebel groups, known as the Contras, in Nicaragua. This illegal operation, uncovered in the mid-1980s, not only violated U.S. law, but also implicated top officials in a tangled web of deception, secrecy, and corruption. The origins of the Iran-Contra affair can be traced back to two major geopolitical concerns. First, the Reagan administration was determined to overthrow the leftist Sandinista government in Nicaragua, which had taken power in 1979. Reagan and his advisors viewed the Sandinistas as a communist threat aligned with the Soviet Union, and they sought to fund the Contras, a paramilitary group aiming to topple the regime. However, Congress had passed the Boland Amendment, which explicitly prohibited the U.S. government from providing military aid to the Contras. This legal restriction forced Reagan's administration to seek alternative, covert methods of financing the rebels. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, tensions between the United States and Iran were at an all-time high, particularly due to the ongoing Iran-Iraq War and the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis. Officially, the U.S. had severed diplomatic ties with Iran and imposed an arms embargo. However, behind closed doors, high-ranking officials within the Reagan administration devised a scheme to secretly sell weapons to Iran in exchange for the release of American hostages held by Hezbollah, a militant group with ties to Iran. The operation was not just a violation of the embargo, but also a contradiction of the U.S. government's public stance against negotiating with terrorists. To make matters worse, the profits from these arms sales were illegally funneled to the Contras in Nicaragua, circumventing Congress's restrictions. This illicit funding enabled the Contras to continue their violent campaign against the Sandinista government, engaging in widespread human rights violations, including assassinations, torture, and drug trafficking. The scandal unraveled in 1986 when a plane carrying supplies for the Contras was shot down in Nicaragua, revealing U.S. involvement. Shortly afterward, investigative journalists and congressional inquiries exposed the full scope of the Iran-Contra operation. Testimonies from key figures such as Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a National Security Council staffer, revealed that top officials, including then Vice President George H.W. Bush, were aware of and possibly complicit in the scheme. Despite overwhelming evidence, many of those involved faced little to no consequences. North, who had played a major role in orchestrating the operation, was convicted on several charges, but later had his convictions overturned. President Ronald Reagan denied knowledge of the details, and his administration largely escaped accountability. The scandal highlighted not only the extent of covert government operations, but also the blatant disregard for legal and ethical boundaries in pursuit of geopolitical goals. The Iran-Contra affair eroded public trust in the government, reinforcing fears that secretive dealings and unaccountable power were deeply embedded within U.S. foreign policy. It also fueled conspiracy theories that similar covert operations continue to this day, hidden behind classified documents and national security justifications. While the scandal officially ended with minimal repercussions for those responsible, it remains a defining example of how power can be abused in the shadows of government bureaucracy. The Franklin Scandal. Allegations of elite child trafficking. The Franklin Scandal is one of the most disturbing and controversial cases of alleged government-linked criminal activity in modern American history. Emerging in the late 1980s, this case revolved around accusations of an elite child trafficking ring that allegedly reached into the highest levels of government, finance, and law enforcement. The allegation suggested that powerful figures were involved in the abuse and exploitation of children, using their influence to silence victims and cover up their crimes. The scandal was tied to the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union in Omaha, Nebraska, and its manager, a well-connected political figure named Lawrence E. King Jr. King, a rising Republican star and known for his extravagant lifestyle, was accused of using the credit union as a front for embezzling millions of dollars. However, as financial investigators probed deeper into the missing funds, far more sinister allegations emerged. Claims that King was at the center of a network trafficking minors to powerful individuals for purposes of sexual exploitation. Victims came forward, testifying that they had been flown across the country to attend exclusive parties where they were allegedly abused by high-ranking politicians, businessmen, and even intelligence operatives. Some accounts suggested that these parties took place in Washington, D.C., and were attended by well-known political figures. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was the alleged involvement of blackmail. Victims and whistleblowers claimed that secret recordings were made of these abusive encounters, possibly to control or manipulate powerful individuals. These claims fueled speculation that the operation was not just about trafficking, but also about maintaining leverage over influential people through compromise, damaging material that could be used for political coercion. The scandal gained national attention when a Nebraska state legislator, John DeCamp, launched an investigation. His efforts led to a grand jury inquiry, but the results were shocking and suspicious. Despite multiple victim testimonies, the grand jury dismissed the allegations as a carefully crafted hoax and instead indicted 2 of the alleged victims for perjury, effectively punishing those who had come forward. This decision further fueled suspicions of a cover-up at the highest levels. The most high-profile case tied to the scandal was that of Paul Bonacci, a young man who testified that he had been a victim of the trafficking ring since childhood. He provided disturbing details about the abuse, naming specific locations and individuals, some of whom held significant political power. Bonacci's claims were dismissed by authorities, but years later, in 1999, he won a civil case against King in which a federal judge ruled in his favor, awarding him $1 million in damages for abuse and emotional distress. Despite this ruling, no high-profile arrests were made, and King himself was only convicted on unrelated fraud charges. The Franklin scandal remained shrouded in mystery, with many believing that crucial evidence was buried and witnesses were silenced. Several people involved in the case died under suspicious circumstances, including Gary Caradori, a private investigator working on the scandal who was killed in a mysterious plane crash. His briefcase, which allegedly contained critical evidence, was never recovered. The case has since been largely forgotten in mainstream discourse, but it continues to resurface in discussions about elite criminal networks, institutional cover-ups, and the extent of government corruption. It serves as a chilling reminder that when power is concentrated in the hands of a few, justice can be easily manipulated, and the truth can be buried beneath layers of deception and intimidation. Project Artichoke, the government's search for the perfect assassin. Project Artichoke was a covert CIA program that sought to push the boundaries of human control, delving into mind manipulation, extreme interrogation techniques, and the creation of involuntary assassins. Launched in 1951 and predating the more infamous MK-Ultra program, ARTICHOKE explored whether drugs, hypnosis, and psychological conditioning could force someone to carry out assassinations without their knowledge. The project, named after the vegetable because one of the CIA officials overseeing it supposedly had an artichoke-like obsession with mind control, was part of the larger Cold War effort to develop counterintelligence tools that could outmatch Soviet techniques. The CIA feared that enemy nations were already experimenting with brainwashing and sought to develop their own methods to influence, interrogate, and even control individuals. Unlike MKUltra, which focused heavily on LSD and psychedelic drugs, Artichoke took a more brutal and experimental approach. The project's scientists used extreme combinations of hypnosis, forced drug addiction, prolonged sleep deprivation, electroshock therapy, and psychological torture to test the limits of human compliance. One of the primary goals was to determine whether a person could be hypnotically programmed to commit murder without remembering it, essentially creating a real-life Manchurian candidate. Some declassified documents suggest that Artichoke researchers conducted experiments in which subjects were given post-hypnotic suggestions to carry out lethal missions, testing whether they would follow through without hesitation. Subjects were often low-ranking military personnel, prisoners, or individuals considered expendable by intelligence agencies. Many experiments were conducted without the subject's full knowledge or consent, adding to the ethical horrors surrounding the program. Some of the most disturbing aspects of Artichoke involved the use of heroin, morphine, and other addictive substances to break individuals down. In some cases, subjects were forcibly addicted to these drugs and then denied them, causing extreme withdrawal symptoms. The CIA would then offer relief in exchange for compliance, conditioning the subjects to associate obedience with the reward of their addiction being temporarily eased. One infamous case tied to Artichoke involved a suspected double agent being interrogated under the influence of powerful hallucinogens. The subject was allegedly kept awake for extended periods, given multiple drugs at once, and subjected to severe psychological torment until their mind was completely broken. Documents indicate that some of these tests took place in overseas CIA black sites, where the agency could avoid U.S. legal constraints. The extreme nature of Artichoke's experiments caught the attention of higher-ups within the CIA, and by the mid-1950s, it was folded into MKUltra, which continued many of its research avenues under a broader scope. However, the legacy of Artichoke remained significant, as it set the stage for future mind control programs and deepened the U.S. government's interest in psychological warfare. The full extent of Artichoke's operations remains unknown due to the destruction of many related documents. The limited declassified files reveal a disturbing willingness to manipulate and exploit human psychology for strategic gain. While the program was officially discontinued, its influence can still be seen in later government psychological operations, interrogation techniques, and the persistent belief that intelligence agencies continue to experiment with forms of mind control. To this day, Artichoke remains one of the most controversial and shadowy programs ever conceived, raising unsettling questions about the true extent of government experimentation and the ethical boundaries intelligence agencies are willing to cross in the name of national security. Operation Gladio, NATO's secret armies and the hidden hand of terror. Operation Gladio is one of the most controversial and least understood conspiracies of the Cold War era, a clandestine program designed to create secret paramilitary networks across Europe, allegedly to counter a potential Soviet invasion. However, as more information surfaced, it became evident that these secret armies were not just defensive cells, but were deeply involved in domestic terrorism, false flag operations, and the suppression of left-wing movements. The program, which was backed by NATO, the CIA, and MI6, operated in the shadows for decades, raising questions about the extent of Western intelligence agencies' involvement in manipulating global events under the guise of fighting communism. The origins of Operation Gladio can be traced back to the aftermath of World War II, when Western powers feared that the Soviet Union would expand its influence into Western Europe. To counter this perceived threat, NATO, in collaboration with intelligence agencies, set up a series of stay-behind networks, groups of trained operatives and paramilitary forces who could wage guerrilla warfare against an invading Soviet force if necessary. These secret armies were supplied with weapons, explosives, and funding, often hidden in underground caches spread across multiple countries, including Italy, France, Germany, Belgium, and beyond. Initially, the justification for these secret armies seemed strategic. If the Soviet Union ever launched an invasion, these operatives would act as a resistance force. However, it soon became evident that the mission of Gladio and its sister organizations went far beyond mere defense. As declassified documents and testimonies from former operatives later revealed, these secret armies engaged in a disturbing array of covert activities, often targeting their own citizens. In Italy, Gladio operatives were implicated in a series of terrorist attacks blamed on left-wing groups, such as the Red Brigades, in what became known as the strategy of tension. The idea was simple. By orchestrating acts of violence and blaming them on communists, intelligence agencies and right-wing factions could manipulate public opinion, justify authoritarian crackdowns, and ensure that leftist movements remained weak and discredited. One of the most infamous attacks linked to Gladio was the 1980 Bologna massacre, in which a bomb exploded at Bologna's central train station, killing 85 people and injuring over 200. Initially, blame was placed on leftist radicals, but later investigations pointed to right-wing extremists with potential ties to Gladio. Similar attacks took place throughout Europe, including bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings, all serving to create chaos and justify repressive government actions. While Italy's Gladio network is the most well-documented, similar operations were carried out across Europe. In Belgium, a wave of terror known as the Brabant massacres involved mysterious gunmen storming supermarkets and slaughtering civilians seemingly at random. The attacks created widespread fear and instability, with some suspecting they were designed to justify increased police powers. In France, Germany, and Turkey, evidence emerged of intelligence-backed paramilitary groups engaging in covert actions that influenced elections, suppressed leftist movements, and maintained right-wing control. In Turkey, Gladio's equivalent, known as the counter-guerrilla, was implicated in numerous extrajudicial killings and human rights abuses, often targeting leftist intellectuals, journalists, and activists. Despite the overwhelming evidence pointing to Gladio's involvement in numerous false flag operations and covert violence, Western governments largely remained silent or denied its existence. The conspiracy was exposed in 1990 when then-Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti confirmed the existence of Gladio to the Italian parliament. However, while Andreotti admitted that Gladio was a NATO-backed operation, he downplayed its more sinister activities, insisting that it had never been involved in terrorism. His statements, however, were contradicted by numerous independent investigations, testimonies from former operatives, and classified documents that indicated otherwise. Following the exposure of Gladio, several European governments launched investigations, but few concrete actions were taken. While some operatives were arrested and tried, many of the highest-ranking officials involved in the program faced no consequences. The scandal reinforced fears that intelligence agencies were operating with near-total impunity, engaging in acts of violence and manipulation without accountability. Operation Gladio raises disturbing questions about the nature of modern democracy, the extent to which intelligence agencies interfere in political affairs, and whether similar covert operations are still active today. While NATO and the CIA officially distanced themselves from Gladio, many believe that its tactics evolved rather than disappeared, continuing under different names and structures. The legacy of Gladio is not just one of historical intrigue, but of an ongoing reality in which governments and intelligence agencies wield hidden power, shaping world events in ways that the public may never fully understand.